I found the first letter hidden beneath a stack of old receipts and takeout menus in the back of her closet. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, a part of me hoping it was just some forgotten note to herself, something insignificant. But as soon as my eyes scanned the words, my stomach dropped. I can't stop thinking about you. Her handwriting. That looping, familiar scrawl I'd seen 1,000 times on grocery lists and birthday cards. But this wasn't written for me. The letter was to someone else. I sank down onto the floor, my mind spinning, trying to comprehend what I was reading. My wife, Emily, was having an affair. There was no mistaking the tenderness in her words, the longing she expressed for someone else, someone I didn't even know. The letter was just one page, short and to the point. She'd written about meeting up soon, about how she missed the way they laughed together. I felt sick. The details were vague, but the implication was clear. This wasn't just a fleeting attraction or a moment of weakness. This had been going on long enough for her to miss him. I sat there for what felt like hours, just staring at that letter, my mind a blur of emotions. How long had this been happening? Who was he? And why hadn't I noticed anything? A deep, gnawing ache settled in my chest as I tried to retrace every conversation, every moment over the past few months. Had I missed the signs? Had I been so wrapped up in my own world that I didn't see her slipping away from me? I wanted to scream, to confront her immediately, but I didn't. Instead, I folded the letter carefully and put it back where I found it. I wasn't ready to deal with this. Not yet. I needed time to think, to figure out what the hell I was going to do next. That night, I couldn't look at her the same way. We sat across from each other at the dinner table, and every word she spoke felt like a lie. Her smile, the one that used to make me feel warm and safe, now felt like a mask. I watched her closely, waiting for some sign of guilt or regret, but she seemed perfectly normal. How could she act like everything was fine when she was hiding something so huge? I excused myself early, telling her I had papers to grade, and retreated to my office. The truth was, I couldn't bear to be near her. The walls felt like they were closing in on me, suffocating me with the weight of this secret. I sat at my desk, staring at a blank page in my notebook, unsure of how to process everything. I wanted to scream, to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Instead, I picked up a pen and started writing. It wasn't a conscious decision. I just needed to get the words out, to make sense of what I was feeling. I wrote. I know about him, about the letters, about everything. The words flowed from me in a rush, raw and unfiltered. I wrote about how hurt I was, how betrayed I felt. I wrote about how I didn't know what to do, how I didn't know if I could ever forgive her. I poured everything out onto the page, my anger, my sadness, my confusion. By the time I was done, the letter was filled with words I'd never be able to say to her face. I folded it up, intending to put it away in a drawer somewhere, but instead, I left it sitting on my desk. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just wanted to see it there, to remind myself that this was real, that I wasn't imagining it. The next morning, I woke up with a dull ache in my chest, the memory of the letter still fresh in my mind. I tried to go about my day as usual, but everything felt different now. Emily kissed me on the cheek before she left for work, and I flinched. She didn't seem to notice. I sat at my desk later that afternoon, staring at the letter again, when I noticed something strange. Another letter had appeared beside it. My heart raced as I picked it up, my hands shaking. I hadn't written this one. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were addressed to me. I know you're hurting. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. What the hell? I read the rest of the letter in stunned silence. It was filled with understanding and empathy, as if the writer knew exactly what I was going through. There was no signature, no clue as to who had written it, but the letter felt deeply personal, almost like they were speaking directly to my soul. For a moment, I wondered if Emily had found my letter and written a response, but the handwriting was completely different. And why would she apologize in such a vague, detached way? No, this was someone else. But who? And how had they found my letter? I looked around the room, half expecting to find some hidden camera or sign that I was being watched, but everything was exactly as I'd left it. The house was silent, empty except for me. I stared at the letter again, a sense of unease settling over me. Who would write something like this, and why? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. None of this made sense, but for some reason, I didn't throw the letter away. I folded it carefully and tucked it into my drawer with the one I had written. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but part of me hoped that maybe, just maybe, another letter would show up. And the next morning, it did. I know you're confused. I wish I could explain everything to you right now, but it's not time yet. Just know that I'm here for you, and I'll help you through this. There it was again, that strange mix of empathy and understanding. The letters continued to come, each one offering a little more insight, a little more comfort. I started writing back, even though I had no idea who I was responding to. It felt strange, like I was having a conversation with someone who wasn't really there, but it was also oddly comforting. It was the first time in days that I felt like I wasn't completely alone. The next few days passed in a blur. I went through the motions of life, going to work, making small talk with colleagues, and coming home to Emily as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I could hardly look at her without feeling a pit in my stomach, wondering what she was doing, who she was thinking about when she smiled at me or when she kissed me goodnight. My mind kept drifting back to the letters, the ones I'd found from her and the ones I'd started receiving from this mysterious stranger. I still hadn't figured out who they were or how they knew so much about me, but the letters had become my lifeline. They were the only thing that made me feel like I wasn't completely drowning in this mess. The third letter appeared a few days after the second, tucked neatly into my desk drawer like the others. This time, the writer was more direct. You don't need to confront her yet. I know you want to, but you're not ready. Trust me. Trust them? I didn't even know who they were, and yet there was something about these letters that I couldn't ignore. Each one seemed to arrive just when I needed it most, saying exactly what I was too afraid to admit to myself. Maybe it was because I didn't want to face the truth, or maybe it was because I was scared that confronting Emily would make everything worse. Either way, I followed the advice. I didn't say anything to her about the affair. Not yet. Instead, I kept writing. I wrote about everything, how hurt I was, how angry I felt, and how lost I was without the relationship I thought we had. The letters became my therapy, my way of coping with the reality that my marriage was falling apart. And every time I wrote a letter, a new one would appear the next day, answering questions I hadn't even realized I was asking. The writer knew me. They knew my fears, my doubts, and the deep, gnawing sense of inadequacy that had started to eat away at me. It's not your fault, they wrote. You're not the reason this happened. But I wasn't so sure. How could it not be my fault? I was her husband. Wasn't it my job to make sure she was happy? To keep our marriage strong? Somewhere along the line, I must have failed, and now she was looking for something or someone else to fill the gap. The idea that I hadn't been enough for her, that I hadn't been enough to keep her from straying, made me feel hollow inside. I wanted to fix things, but I didn't even know where to start. That's when I started to depend on the letters even more. They weren't just a mystery anymore. They were a source of comfort, a way to navigate the storm I was trapped in. And as strange as it was, I started to feel connected to whoever was writing to me. It was like they understood me on a level that no one else ever had, not even Emily. I caught myself waiting for the next letter with anticipation, like it was some kind of lifeline. When it arrived, it didn't disappoint. You're stronger than you think, the letter said. This isn't the end, it's just a transition. A transition? I couldn't figure out what that meant, but the words gave me hope. Maybe there was still a way to come out of this without losing everything. Maybe there was still a chance to save my marriage, or at least save myself from the wreckage. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, I sat at my desk and started writing again. But this time, instead of writing another letter filled with anger and confusion, I wrote something different. Who are you? I asked. How do you know so much about me? I didn't expect an answer. Whoever this person was, they'd managed to stay hidden so far, and I doubted they'd reveal themselves just because I asked. But still, I had to try. The not knowing was starting to get to me. When I found the response the next morning, I was shocked. You already know who I am, it read. You just don't realize it yet. That line haunted me for days. How could I know who they were? I racked my brain, going over every person in my life, every possible explanation, but nothing made sense. If this person was someone I knew, why wouldn't they just come forward? And how were they leaving these letters for me without being caught? Despite the confusion, I kept writing. The letters had become my only outlet, the only way I could make sense of what was happening. And as time went on, I noticed something strange. The more I wrote to this mysterious person, the less I felt like I needed to confront Emily. It wasn't that I had forgiven her or that the pain had gone away. It hadn't. But the letters gave me a kind of clarity I hadn't expected. They helped me see that this wasn't just about the affair. It was about everything that had led up to it, all the small cracks in our marriage that we had ignored for years. "She's not the only one who's been distant," one letter said. "You've been pulling away too." I hated to admit it, but they were right. I had been pulling away. Maybe not consciously, but over time, I'd stopped trying as hard as I used to. Work had become my escape, and I'd let the stress of life build a wall between us. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made me realize that we were both at fault, in different ways. One night, after another long day of pretending everything was fine, I found myself sitting at my desk again, staring at a blank piece of paper. I wanted to ask more questions, to dig deeper into who this person was and how they knew so much. But instead, I wrote something I hadn't written before. What should I do? It felt strange, asking for advice from someone I didn't know, but I was at a loss. I had no idea how to fix this. I didn't even know if it could be fixed. The next morning, I found the response waiting for me, as usual. But this time, the letter was different. "You already know the answer," it said. "You just need the courage to act on it." I stared at those words for a long time. Did I know the answer? Part of me thought I did, but the fear of what might happen if I actually confronted Emily had been holding me back. I wasn't ready to face the truth, because once I did, there would be no going back. But maybe that was the point. The writer was pushing me to do something I'd been too scared to do, take control of my own life. After all these weeks of waiting for answers, of hoping that things would magically fix themselves, I realized that wasn't going to happen. If I wanted my life to change, I had to be the one to change it. I had to stop hiding behind these letters and face reality. The next letter that arrived was short, but it hit me harder than any of the others. "You can't move forward until you let go of the past." Let go of the past? I didn't know if I was ready to do that, but maybe it was time to try. I kept thinking about that last letter. You can't move forward until you let go of the past. It was such a simple statement, but it carried so much weight. How could I let go of the past when the past had become everything? It was the foundation of my pain, the reason why I couldn't sleep at night, the reason why every moment with Emily felt like a lie. Letting go felt impossible, like it would mean erasing everything that had happened, pretending that her betrayal hadn't cut me as deeply as it had. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized the letter was right. I couldn't keep living in this limbo. Every day I spent pretending things were normal. I was slowly losing myself. The weight of the unspoken truth between us was suffocating, and I had to either confront it or let it destroy me. But that didn't make it any easier. Every time I looked at Emily, I saw the woman I'd loved for years, the woman I'd built a life with, and I didn't know how to reconcile that image with the woman who had betrayed me. I couldn't figure out how to confront her without shattering everything we had left. And if I did confront her, what then? Would we try to work through it? Could we even rebuild something from the ashes of this mess? Or would it all just fall apart, leaving me standing alone in the ruins of our marriage? I didn't know the answer, and I didn't know if I was ready to find out. So instead of confronting her, I kept writing. I poured everything into the letters, every doubt, every fear, every bit of anger I had buried inside me. And each time I wrote, the mysterious responses continued to appear. They weren't always direct answers, but they were always insightful, always pushing me to think deeper about my own role in this mess. One night, after Emily had gone to bed, I sat at my desk with a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the latest letter. "You're not alone in this," it said. "She's hurting too." Hurting? How could she be hurting? She was the one who had cheated. She was the one who had broken our trust, the one who had turned to someone else while I was still here, trying to make things work. But as much as I wanted to dismiss the idea, I couldn't shake it. Maybe she was hurting. Maybe she had been hurting long before the affair started, and maybe that hurt had driven her to seek comfort in someone else. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made me think about our marriage in a way I hadn't before. When had we stopped communicating? When had we started drifting apart? I tried to remember the last time we'd really talked, the last time we'd shared something real, and I realized I couldn't. We had been living side by side, going through the motions of life, but we hadn't really been connecting for a long time. It was like we'd both been sleepwalking through our marriage, too distracted by work, by responsibilities, by everything else, to notice that we were slowly losing each other. That night, I wrote a letter asking about the drifting, the slow disintegration of something that had once felt so solid. "What do I do if we've both been at fault?" I wrote. "How do I fix something that's been broken for so long?" The response the next morning was brief but direct. "You start by being honest, with yourself and with her." Honesty. It seemed so simple, but it was the thing I'd been avoiding since the moment I found that first letter. I hadn't been honest with her or with myself. I'd been hiding behind the letters, behind my fear, because I didn't want to face the reality of what had happened. But I knew I couldn't keep doing that. If I wanted any chance of saving our marriage, or even just saving myself, I had to confront her. I had to stop pretending. The next few days passed slowly. I kept waiting for the right moment, the right time to bring it up, but there never seemed to be one. Every time I thought about saying something, I felt my throat tighten and my heart race. I was terrified of what might happen, terrified that confronting her would tear apart whatever fragile connection we had left. But I also knew that I couldn't keep living like this. The longer I waited, the more the weight of it all pressed down on me, suffocating me. Finally, one night after dinner, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. We were sitting on the couch, watching some mindless show on TV, and I couldn't focus on anything but the words I knew I had to say. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding in my chest, but I turned to her and said the words that had been burning inside me for weeks. "I know about the letters." The silence that followed was deafening. Emily didn't move, didn't say a word at first. She just stared at me, her face a mixture of shock and something else, maybe guilt, maybe fear. I couldn't tell. For a moment, I thought she was going to deny it, thought she was going to try to talk her way out of it. But then her eyes filled with tears, and she looked away. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. And just like that, the dam broke. All the anger, all the pain I'd been holding in came flooding out. I didn't yell, didn't scream, but my words were sharp, cutting through the air between us. I asked her why, asked her how she could do this to me, to us. I asked her if she even loved me anymore. And through it all, she just sat there, tears streaming down her face, offering apologies, but no real answers. "I don't know why," she said at one point, her voice shaking. I felt so alone. I felt like you didn't see me anymore." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I had been so focused on my own pain, my own sense of betrayal, that I hadn't stopped to think about how she might have been feeling. But hearing her say it, hearing the raw emotion in her voice, I realized that maybe I hadn't seen her. Maybe I had been so wrapped up in my own life, my own stress, that I hadn't noticed the distance growing between us. It didn't excuse what she'd done. It didn't make the affair any less painful, but it made me see things differently. We had both been drifting, both been hurting in ways we hadn't talked about, and maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance to fix it. We talked for hours that night. It wasn't an easy conversation. There were tears, there was anger, and there were moments when I thought we wouldn't be able to get through it. But for the first time in a long time, we were being honest with each other. We were talking about the things we had both been avoiding for years, the loneliness, the fear, the feeling that we had somehow lost each other along the way. By the end of the night, we weren't magically fixed. There was no sudden moment of forgiveness, no easy solution to the mess we had found ourselves in. But there was something else, something fragile but real, a sense that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move forward. Together. As I lay in bed that night, Emily sleeping beside me, I thought about the letters, the mysterious advice, the way they had pushed me to confront my fears, to be honest with myself and with her. I still didn't know who was writing them or how they seemed to know so much about my life. But one thing was clear. Without those letters, I never would have had the courage to face the truth. And now, with the truth out in the open, it was up to me to figure out what came next. The days after our conversation were strange. Emily and I were talking more, and there was a sense that the heavy silence between us had finally lifted, but it was far from easy. We were both walking on eggshells, unsure of how to navigate the fragile peace we had found. Every interaction felt loaded, like we were waiting for the other shoe to drop. I'd catch her looking at me with this mix of guilt and fear, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was still thinking about him, the man she had been writing those letters to. I tried not to ask, but it gnawed at me, the uncertainty of it all. At night, I'd lie awake, replaying everything we had talked about, trying to figure out where to go from here. We had agreed to try counseling, to take small steps toward rebuilding what we'd lost, but I wasn't sure if that was even possible. How do you rebuild trust when the foundation of your marriage has been cracked wide open? I kept thinking about those letters, the ones I had written, and the ones that had mysteriously appeared. Whoever had been writing to me had pushed me to confront the truth. But now that I wasn't sure what came next. And then a new letter arrived. This one was different. It wasn't filled with advice or empathy like the others had been. It was shorter, more direct, and it left me feeling uneasy. "You've done the hardest part," it said, "but you're not done yet. There's more you need to know." I stared at the words for a long time, my heart pounding in my chest. What did that mean? What more was there to know? I had already confronted Emily. We had already talked through the affair. What else was there? I felt a chill run down my spine. The letters had been so helpful up until now, guiding me through the worst of it. But this one felt like a warning. Like there was something still lurking in the shadows, something I hadn't uncovered yet. I didn't know if I was ready for that. I didn't know if I could handle another revelation. But as much as I wanted to ignore it, I couldn't. The letter had planted a seed of doubt in my mind, and now I couldn't stop thinking about it. What if there was more? What if Emily hadn't told me everything? The thought gnawed at me, even as I tried to push it away. I didn't want to believe that she was still hiding something, but the letters had been right about everything else so far. What if they were right about this too? A few days passed, and the tension between Emily and me grew again. It wasn't like before, when we were avoiding each other or pretending everything was fine. This time, it was because we were both trying, really trying, but the weight of what had happened was still there, hanging over us. We were both tiptoeing around it, afraid to dig too deep for fear of what we might find. One night, after another strained conversation about going to therapy, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I had to know if there was something else she wasn't telling me. The letter's words echoed in my head. "There's more you need to know." I waited until Emily was asleep, then slipped out of bed and quietly went to her closet. I didn't even know what I was looking for, but I had this nagging feeling that there was something I had missed. My heart pounded in my chest as I searched through her things, the guilt of what I was doing weighing heavily on me. But I couldn't stop myself. I had to know. And then, tucked away in the back of a drawer, I found it. Another letter. My hands shook as I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words, and as I read, the blood drained from my face. It wasn't just an emotional affair. The letter was from him, and it was clear that they had slept together. It wasn't just an exchange of words or longing glances. It had gone further. Much further. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. The room spun around me, and I had to sit down, my hands trembling as I held the letter. How could she not have told me this? We had talked, we had opened up to each other, and I thought we were finally being honest. But she had still kept this from me. She had lied by omission, letting me believe that it had only been emotional, that they hadn't crossed that line. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the letter, trying to process what it meant. Part of me wanted to march into the bedroom and confront her right then and there, to demand answers. But another part of me, the part that was already so tired, so drained from everything we had been through, didn't know if I had the strength to face her again. I folded the letter and put it back where I had found it. Then I went to my office, sat down at my desk, and stared at the blank piece of paper in front of me. My mind was racing, 1,000 thoughts all fighting for space, but one kept rising to the surface. I picked up the pen and started writing. This time, I didn't ask for advice. I didn't pour out my feelings or my confusion. I just wrote the truth. She lied to me again. I left the letter on my desk and went to bed, but sleep didn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying everything I had just read. I felt betrayed all over again, like we had gone right back to the beginning. All the progress we had made felt like a lie. How could I trust anything she said now? The next morning, when I found the response on my desk, I wasn't sure if I wanted to read it. Part of me didn't want to hear any more cryptic advice, didn't want to be pushed further down this path of pain and doubt. But I couldn't ignore it. I opened the letter and braced myself. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," it read. "But you needed to know the full truth. Now that you do, you can finally decide what you want." I stared at the words, feeling a strange sense of clarity wash over me. It was true. Now that I knew everything, or at least I hoped I did, I could finally make a decision. I could decide whether or not I wanted to keep fighting for this marriage, whether or not I could forgive her for what she had done. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about whether or not I could move forward, whether or not we could rebuild something from the broken pieces of what we once had. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel completely lost. I still didn't know what I was going to do, but at least now I had all the information. There were no more secrets, no more half-truths. I could finally make a choice, not based on what I didn't know, but on the reality of the situation. But as I sat there, staring at the letter, another thought crept into my mind. How had the writer known? How had they known that there was more, that I needed to dig deeper? The mystery of it all was starting to feel less like comfort and more like something else, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I folded the letter and put it away, deciding to focus on the next steps instead of the questions swirling in my mind. But the nagging feeling didn't go away. There was something more to this, something I still didn't understand, and I wasn't sure I was ready to find out. I sat there, staring at the letter, letting the weight of everything settle on me. The truth had been right in front of me all along, and I had missed it. Or maybe I had just refused to see it. I had spent so much time looking for answers outside of myself, hoping the letters would somehow guide me to a solution, but now I realized that no one could make this decision for me. Not even the mysterious writer, who seemed to know more about my life than I did. The room felt suffocating, the walls closing in on me as the reality of it all crashed down. Emily had lied to me again. Even after our long, painful conversation, where I thought we had laid everything bare, she had still held something back. The most important truth, that she had slept with him. It was like a punch to the gut, a betrayal on top of a betrayal. I couldn't understand why she hadn't just told me. Why go through all the motions of honesty only to keep something like that hidden? I pushed back from my desk and stood, pacing the small space of my office. My mind was racing, thoughts colliding with one another. But one thing kept rising to the surface. I needed to confront her. I couldn't keep sitting here, stewing in my own anger and confusion. I had to face her, even if I wasn't sure what I was going to say. I left the office and walked down the hall to our bedroom. Emily was sitting up in bed, reading, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit. The sight of her, so calm and comfortable, made my stomach turn. How could she just sit there, acting like everything was fine, when everything was so far from fine? I stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering my thoughts, trying to find the right words. But when she looked up at me and smiled, it all came tumbling out in a rush. I found another letter. Her smile faltered, and she set the book down slowly, her eyes widening in confusion, or maybe fear. I couldn't tell. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice soft but wary. I said, stepping into the room, "I found another letter from him, and it told me everything you didn't." Her face drained of color, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it, might try to lie again. But then she closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. "When?" I asked, my voice rising. "When were you going to tell me, Emily? After we'd started therapy, after I had convinced myself that we could fix this?" She opened her eyes and looked at me, and in that moment, I saw the guilt and the shame that had been hiding beneath the surface all along. "I didn't know how," she said, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to hurt you more than I already had." I let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through my hair. "You didn't want to hurt me? Do you have any idea how much worse this is, knowing that you've been lying to me even after we talked? Even after I thought we were finally being honest with each other?" She looked down at her hands, her shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, but the words felt hollow. They didn't mean anything anymore. Sorry wasn't enough to fix this. Sorry didn't erase the fact that she had broken my trust again. I sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to make sense of the mess we were in. "Why, Emily?" I asked, my voice quieter now, the anger giving way to something else. Something more raw, more vulnerable. "Why didn't you just tell me?" She was silent for a long time, and I thought maybe she wasn't going to answer. But then she looked at me, her eyes red with unshed tears. "I was scared," she said. "I was scared that if you knew everything, you wouldn't want to try anymore, that you'd give up on us." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. That's what it had all been about. Fear. Fear of losing what little we had left. And maybe, in some twisted way, I understood that. I had been afraid too. Afraid of what confronting the truth would mean. Afraid of what we might lose if we actually faced what had happened between us. But understanding didn't make it any easier to swallow. It didn't erase the hurt, didn't make the betrayal any less painful. I took a deep breath and looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't see the woman who had betrayed me. I saw the woman I had loved for so long, the woman I had built a life with. And despite everything, I still loved her. That was the hardest part. I still loved her, even though I wasn't sure if I could ever forgive her. "I don't know what to do," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can move past this." She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over mine, and for a moment I thought about pulling away. But then I let her touch me, let her fingers curl around mine. "I don't know either," she said, her voice just as quiet. "But I want to try. I want to try to make this right, even if it takes the rest of my life." We sat there in silence for what felt like hours, neither of us knowing what to say. The weight of everything that had happened hung heavy between us, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel completely alone in it. Emily was there, and despite everything, despite all the lies and the pain, I knew that she wanted to fix this as much as I did. But knowing that didn't make the road ahead any less daunting. We had a long way to go, and I wasn't sure if we'd ever be able to get back to where we once were. Hell, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to get back there. Maybe we needed to build something new, something stronger, something more honest. I didn't know if it was possible, but as I sat there, holding her hand, I realized that maybe the letters had been right all along. I had been so focused on the past, so consumed by the hurt and the betrayal, that I hadn't even considered the possibility of a future. A future where we could rebuild, where we could learn from our mistakes and try again. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing about this would be easy. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. A small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way through this. And as I sat there, that nagging feeling I'd had about the letters, the mystery of who had been writing them, how they seemed to know so much, began to fade. It didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the choice I had to make, the choice we both had to make. I squeezed her hand and she looked at me, her eyes filled with a mix of hope and fear. "We'll take it one step at a time," I said softly, "but no more lies. We have to be honest about everything." She nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks, and I knew in that moment that no matter what happened, we were in this together. It wasn't a guarantee of a happy ending, but it was a start. And that was enough for now. The first therapy session came quicker than I expected. I had made the call the day after our conversation, and by some miracle, we got an appointment within the week. Emily and I both sat in the waiting room, the silence between us thick with tension. We hadn't talked much since that night, both of us unsure how to navigate this new territory of fragile honesty. But we were here. We were trying. That had to count for something. The therapist's office was warm, filled with soft lighting and comfortable chairs that seemed designed to put people at ease. It didn't work for me. I felt a tight knot in my stomach the entire time, my hands gripping the armrests of the chair like they were the only thing keeping me grounded. Emily sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes downcast. I wondered if she felt the same mix of anxiety and dread that I did. The therapist, Dr. Geller, was a soft-spoken woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and an air of calm that felt completely at odds with the storm raging inside me. She introduced herself, asked us some basic questions about our relationship, and then dove right in. "So, what brings you here?" she asked gently, her eyes flicking between the two of us. For a moment, neither of us said anything. I could feel Emily's eyes on me, waiting for me to speak first. I didn't want to. I didn't want to be the one to lay it all out, to admit to a stranger that my wife had cheated on me and that I had been too scared or too broken to confront it for so long. But I knew I had to. This was part of the process, the first step toward whatever future we were trying to build. "We're here because she had an affair," I said, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. "And I found out, but we're trying to, I don't know, fix things, I guess." Emily winced at my bluntness, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, her eyes still fixed on the floor. Dr. Geller didn't flinch. She didn't look surprised or shocked. She just nodded, like she had heard this story 100 times before. Maybe she had. "Okay," she said, her voice still calm. "That's a good place to start. How long have you known about the affair?" "A few months," I said, but I didn't confront her right away. I didn't know how. "And how did you eventually confront her?" Dr. Geller asked, her gaze steady. I hesitated, glancing at Emily, who finally looked up at me. There was no judgment in her eyes, just the same tired sadness that had been there for weeks. "I found some letters," I said, "from him, and I kept them to myself for a while. Then I started writing letters, to myself, I guess, and then I got letters back." Dr. Geller raised an eyebrow. "Letters back? From whom?" I swallowed, suddenly feeling foolish for even bringing it up. The letters had seemed so important, so significant when I was in the middle of everything. But now, sitting here, talking about them to a therapist, they sounded ridiculous. "I don't know," I said. "Someone. I never figured out who. But they knew things, about me, about what I was going through. It's hard to explain." There was a pause as Dr. Geller considered this, and for a moment, I thought she might dismiss it as some kind of coping mechanism, something I had imagined in my grief and confusion. But instead, she just nodded again. Sometimes, when we're going through intense emotional experiences, we find ways to communicate with parts of ourselves that we might not normally access. These letters, whether they came from someone else or from within you, seem to have helped you process what was happening. I hadn't thought of it that way. I had always been so focused on the mystery of the letters, on figuring out who had written them, that I hadn't considered the possibility that they were just a reflection of what I needed to hear. "Maybe," I said quietly. "And how do you feel about the affair now?" Dr. Geller asked, turning her attention to me again. "Do you think you've reached a place where you can begin to forgive?" I didn't know how to answer that. Forgiveness felt like such a distant concept, something that I wasn't even sure I wanted to reach for. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I want to. I think. But it's hard. I feel like every time I think we're getting somewhere, I remember what happened, and it all comes crashing back down." Emily shifted in her seat beside me, her hands twisting in her lap. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," she said softly. "I know I hurt you. I know it's going to take time, but I'm here. I'm trying. I want to make this right." Her words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of hope. But it was still buried beneath layers of anger and pain, and I didn't know how to dig it out. Dr. Geller leaned forward slightly, her gaze gentle but focused. "Forgiveness is a process," she said. "It doesn't happen overnight. It's something that you'll both need to work toward, and it's okay if you're not ready yet. What's important is that you're here, that you're both willing to put in the effort to rebuild trust." That's the foundation. Rebuilding trust. The idea felt almost laughable, considering everything that had happened, but I knew she was right. Trust was the foundation of any relationship, and ours had been shattered. If we were going to move forward, we would have to rebuild it, brick by brick. The rest of the session was a blur. We talked about communication, about the importance of honesty, about setting boundaries and expectations for the future. It was all practical advice, things that made sense in theory but felt impossible to implement in the mess that was our marriage. Still, I knew it was a start. We were taking the first steps, even if they felt small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things. When the session ended, Emily and I walked out of the office together, the silence between us less tense than it had been before. We hadn't fixed anything, not really, but we had started talking, and that was something. The drive home was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I kept thinking about what Dr. Geller had said about forgiveness being a process. I had spent so much time focusing on the past, on what Emily had done, that I hadn't allowed myself to think about what I wanted for the future. Did I want to stay with her? Did I want to try to rebuild what we had? Or was it too broken to fix? When we got home, I went straight to my office, needing some space to clear my head. I sat down at my desk, staring at the blank page in front of me. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel the urge to write a letter. The need to reach out to some unknown force for guidance had faded, replaced by the realization that no one could tell me what to do. The decision was mine. I thought about everything that had happened, the affair, the lies, the letters. I thought about Emily, about the look on her face when she had admitted the full truth to me. I thought about the therapy session, about the small glimmer of hope I had felt, buried beneath all the hurt. And then, finally, I asked myself the question I had been avoiding for so long. Could I forgive her? The answer didn't come immediately. It didn't hit me like some sudden revelation or a lightning bolt of clarity. It was slow, gradual, like the thawing of ice after a long winter. I didn't know if I could forgive her right now, but I wanted to try. I wanted to try because, despite everything, I still loved her. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to start with. I didn't write a letter that night. Instead, I went back to the bedroom where Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her face etched with worry. I sat down beside her, took a deep breath, and finally spoke the words I had been holding inside. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet," I said quietly, "but I want to try." Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of guilt or shame. They were tears of relief. "That's all I can ask for," she whispered, reaching for my hand. We sat there in silence for a long time, holding hands, not knowing what the future held, but finally ready to face it together.